She was 24 and newly widowed, with a black mourning dress worn thin at the elbows, a solicitor's key wrapped in brown paper, and 11 shillings knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that, Martha Hayes became the reluctant owner of a rotting stone manor on the edge of Willow Ridge, a house her husband's family had laughed at her for accepting. But what none of them knew, and what none of them had bothered to check, in the 30 years the place had stood shuttered, was that behind the library wall, there was something that would turn every one of their smirks to ash. Settle in with a cup of tea, and if you like quiet stories told slowly, subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Martha Hayes had been born in a narrow brick cottage on the Northamptonshire Road, the only surviving child of a wheelwright named Thomas Hayes and his wife Alice, who had lost 3 infants before Martha and none after. Her father was a careful man who could measure a fellow by eye and who kept his ledgers in a copperplate hand so neat that the parish clerk sometimes borrowed his phrasing. Her mother had been a lady's maid before her marriage and had brought into the cottage the small refinements of a great house: folded linen, mended lace, a habit of speaking softly to the kettle when it boiled. And she taught Martha to read from a battered edition of Cowper's poems that had belonged to her old mistress. There had been enough in that house, though never much, and Martha had grown up believing that enough was a thing you built with your hands, one straight seam and one paid account at a time. When she was 11, her mother fell ill of a fever that swept through the low lanes by the river, and though the doctor came twice and bled her once, she did not last the month. It was after that Martha was sent, twice a week and then daily, to the household of a widow named Mrs. Bettridge, who kept the last big house at the edge of their parish, and who had, for reasons no one quite understood, taken an interest in the wheelwright's grave-eyed girl. Mrs. Bettridge was 63 and childless, and had once been housekeeper to a baronet in Lincolnshire, and she taught Martha the things her mother had not lived long enough to finish teaching her: how to render lard clean, how to stop a chimney smoking, how to keep an account book that would satisfy a magistrate, how to make a mustard poultice, how to lay a fire so it would burn all night on 3 lumps of coal. She taught her, most of all, how to look at a neglected room and see what could be saved in it and what could not. And she was the first person in Martha's life who said aloud that the girl was clever, and said it plainly, and did not soften it. From Mrs. Bettridge, Martha received 2 things she kept always. The first was practical: a slim brass-bound receipt book of household remedies and cookery notes, written in Mrs. Bettridge's crabbed hand and inscribed on the flyleaf, "For Martha, who listens." The second was smaller and dearer: a silver thimble, polished from long use, that had belonged to Mrs. Bettridge's own mother, given over one gray afternoon in the sewing room, without ceremony, and with only the words, "You will use it more than I do now." Martha wore it on a length of green ribbon inside her bodice, from the day of Mrs. Bettridge's funeral, 3 winters later, and she had not been parted from it since. She was 17 when she went into service properly, first as a still-room maid in a rectory near Kettering, and then, at 19, as a companion and needlewoman in the household of a Mr. Edmund Whitcomb, a gentleman of small fortune and gentler manners, whose only son, Henry, was a year older than Martha, and who read to his father in the evenings, and who fell, slowly, and then all at once, in love with the girl who mended the drawing-room curtains. Their marriage was quiet, and, in the eyes of Henry's mother and his 2 older sisters, deeply inconvenient. Martha had no dowry, no connections, no pedigree, and no polish beyond what Mrs. Bettridge had drilled into her. And though Henry's father had welcomed her with a tired kindness, his mother had never once addressed her by her Christian name. They had 18 months together. Henry was thrown from a hired horse on the road to Market Harborough in the spring of her 24th year, and he lived 4 days after, long enough to hold her hand, and long enough to ask his father, in a whisper that everyone in the room heard, to see that Martha was not turned out. His father promised. His father died 6 weeks later of a chest complaint, and by then the promise was only a memory in a room full of people who had never wanted her there. What Martha carried out of that house, when the time came, was very little. Her mourning dress, a change of linen, the brass-bound receipt book, the silver thimble on its green ribbon, a miniature of Henry, no larger than a florin, in a tortoiseshell case, and the certainty, hard-won and quiet, that she had been loved by 3 people in her life, her mother, Mrs. Bettridge, and Henry, and that all 3 of them were dead, and that whatever came next, she would have to build alone, with the tools they had left her, and with the steady hands they had said were hers. The manner of her going was arranged, as such things always were in that house, by other people at a table she was not invited to sit at. 10 days after Henry's father was buried, a solicitor came down from London, a Mr. Palmer, thin as a rush and dressed in dusty black, and read the will aloud in the small parlor, with the shutters half closed against the afternoon light. Henry's mother sat straight-backed in her husband's chair. The 2 sisters, Augusta and Beatrice, sat on either side of her, like matched candlesticks. Martha was placed on a hard stool near the door, as though she were a witness rather than a widow, and she folded her hands in her lap and listened. The estate proper, and the London leases, and the funds in the 3%, and the plate and the horses, and the good furniture, all passed to Henry's mother, for her lifetime, and then to Augusta and Beatrice in equal parts. There was a page of small legacies to servants. There was a bequest of books to a cousin in Norwich. And then, near the bottom, in a paragraph Mr. Palmer read with careful neutrality, there was the matter of a property in Willow Ridge, a stone manor, and its grounds, which the late Mr. Whitcomb had inherited from an aunt some years before, and had never troubled to visit, and which he had, by a codicil, signed the week before his death, directed be conveyed to his daughter-in-law, Martha Whitcomb, née Hayes, absolutely, and without encumbrance. There was a small silence. Then Augusta laughed. It was a short, dry laugh, the kind used to close a door, and Beatrice smiled behind her handkerchief, and Henry's mother said, without looking at Martha, that it was very like her husband to keep his promises with the least valuable thing in his possession. Mr. Palmer coughed and passed Martha a small brown paper packet containing a heavy iron key and a folded page of directions in a clerk's hand. He said the house had been shuttered these 30 years, and that she should not expect to find it in any condition to be lived in. Augusta said, more clearly this time, that Martha was welcome to the ruin if she thought she could keep the rain out of it. Henry's mother rose then, and said, in a voice as level as a shelf, that arrangements had been made for the mail coach on Thursday, and that Martha's things would be ready in the hall. That was all. No one raised a hand, and no one raised a voice. By nightfall, her small trunk stood by the front door, with a label tied to its handle, in Beatrice's neat script, and Martha sat on the edge of her narrow bed and untied the corner of a linen handkerchief and counted her money. 11 shillings. She knotted them back into the handkerchief. She laid out on the coverlet, as Mrs. Bettridge had once taught her to do before any journey, the things she meant to take, the mourning dress she stood up in, and one folded beneath, a change of linen, the brass-bound receipt book, the silver thimble on its green ribbon which she never took off, the miniature of Henry in its tortoiseshell case, and the brown paper packet with the iron key inside. She did not weep. She did not go to the drawing-room to make her farewells. On Thursday morning, before the household was properly awake, she walked out of the front door, with her trunk lifted by the boot-boy onto a cart, and no one came down to see her off. The mail coach took her as far as Rugby, and from Rugby a slower stage carried her northwest into a country she did not know. It rained the first day and cleared the second, and Martha sat by the window and watched the landscape change beneath her, without speaking. The neat enclosed fields of Northamptonshire gave way to rougher pasture, then to long stretches of moorland, edged with dry stone walls that ran up over the shoulders of low hills and disappeared into cloud. There were fewer villages, and the villages were smaller, and the churches sat squat and gray among yews that looked older than the churches. She ate what she had brought: a piece of hard cheese wrapped in a napkin, a heel of bread, an apple that had begun to wrinkle, and she paid a penny at a coaching inn for a mug of weak tea, and did not order anything more. She slept, when she slept, sitting up, with her cheek against the cold glass, and her hand inside her bodice, on the silver thimble. Somewhere in the second afternoon, a farmer's wife across from her, seeing the mourning dress and the pale, still face above it, offered her a piece of gingerbread wrapped in brown paper without a word, and Martha took it, and thanked her, and ate half and saved the rest. On the third day, the coach set her down at a crossroads a mile short of Willow Ridge, because the road that turned off toward the village was too poor for the wheels, and the guard handed her trunk down into the mud and touched his hat and drove on. She stood for a moment in the wind, with the trunk at her feet, and looked about her. There was a low gray sky, and a stone bridge over a small brown river, and beyond the bridge a track that curved between hedgerows, still bare from the winter. A rook rose from a plowed field, and cried once, and was gone. She tied her bonnet strings tighter, and lifted one end of the trunk, and dragged it a little way and stopped, and then she saw, coming down the track from the village, a boy of perhaps 12, leading a donkey with a wooden pannier saddle. He looked at her, and at the trunk, and at the mud, and he said, without preamble, that a penny would carry it to wherever she was going. She gave him the penny. He loaded the trunk onto the donkey with the ease of long practice, and she walked beside him along the muddy track toward Willow Ridge, and as they came round the last bend, she saw the manor for the first time, standing above the village on a low rise among unpruned limes, its roof sagging at one end, and its windows shuttered and blind, and she stopped in the road and looked at it a long moment, and she did not say anything at all. The boy waited without impatience while she took it in, and then he led the donkey up the last of the rise and set the trunk down on the flagged step under the porch. She paid him another halfpenny for his trouble, and he touched his cap and went back down the lane, whistling something tuneless, and Martha stood alone with the iron key in her palm and looked at the house that was now hers. It was long and low, and built of the local gray stone, 2 stories with attic dormers above, and a slate roof that had gone bowed at the west end, where a chimney stack leaned against the sky. The front had 5 bays, and each window was closed behind shutters that had once been painted green and were now the color of wet moss. The door was oak, banded with iron, and the lock had gone red with rust. She turned the key twice before it moved, and then it moved with a heavy, soft click that seemed to come from a long way inside the wood. The door opened onto a flagged hall, smelling of cold stone and old smoke, and the faint sweetness of dry rot. To her right rose a staircase of oak, with a broken baluster on the 3rd step. To her left, a doorway gave into a parlor, whose ceiling had shed plaster in one corner, in a great scallop, and beyond that, a passage ran back into the body of the house. She walked slowly from room to room, without unpinning her bonnet. She counted 11 rooms on the ground floor, and 9 above, not including the attics, and she noted each one in her mind, the way Mrs. Bettridge had taught her, what could be saved, what could not, what only wanted labor. The kitchen at the back had a great open range black with old grease, a copper still hanging from a bracket, a stone sink with a lead pipe, and a scrubbed deal table with one leg propped on a broken brick. The dairy beyond was tiled in white and blue, and still cold. In the scullery, a mouse ran along the skirting and vanished. Upstairs, 3 bedchambers had been left with their furniture under Holland sheets, and when she lifted a corner of one sheet, she found a 4-post bed of dark wood, with hangings so dusted they crumbled between her fingers, and beneath the dust, a coverlet of good quilted linen that would wash. The library was at the west end of the ground floor, a long room with 2 windows that faced the walled garden, and a fireplace of blackened marble between them. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, in oak that had darkened almost to bog. Books stood in them still, several hundred volumes, mildew spotted at their tops, and on the floor was a long table on which lay a brass inkstand furred green, and a quill gone the color of straw. The 4th wall, the inner one, was paneled in the same oak, and hung with an old estate map foxed at its edges. There was damp in one corner, and a slow blister rose in the plaster of the ceiling above the west window, and a bird had at some time come down the chimney and left a small pile of feathers and bone on the hearth. She stood in the middle of the library, and set down her trunk and untied her bonnet at last, and she felt for a moment neither despair nor gladness, but only the quiet arithmetic of what would need to be done first. She slept that night wrapped in her cloak, on the quilted coverlet, in the smallest of the upper chambers, with the door bolted and the silver thimble against her skin, and in the morning she began. For 3 days she did nothing but open shutters and sweep. She swept until her arms ached and her hair was gray with dust, and she carried out barrow-loads of leaves and mouse nest and broken plaster to a pit at the back of the kitchen garden. She lit her first fire in the range with 3 dry sticks from the woodshed and a page of old newsprint she found lining a drawer, and she boiled water in a copper pot she scoured with sand from the yard. On the 4th day she began on the library, because the library, she thought, was where she would keep her accounts, and a woman who meant to keep accounts needed a clean room in which to keep them. She took down the books shelf by shelf and stacked them on the long table. She wiped each spine with a damp cloth and set them in the sun of the window to air. She rolled up the estate map and stood it in a corner. She was working along the paneled inner wall with her cloth when her knuckles struck the wood, and she heard, quite distinctly, that a portion of the wall was not solid behind. She stopped and knocked again with the flat of her hand, moving along the panels, and the sound changed at a place about 4 feet wide, between 2 carved pilasters, hollow where the rest was dead. She fetched a lamp and a small pry-bar from the tool chest in the scullery. She ran her fingers along the molding, and found, at the top of the hollow section, a peg of oak-driven flush with the grain. She worked at it with the point of the bar until it gave, and then a second peg, and a third, and then the whole panel loosened in its frame, and she lifted it out and set it aside against the shelves. Behind it was a shallow cupboard, 3 feet deep, lined in unpainted pine, and standing in the cupboard on a low shelf were a japanned tin box, the size of a family Bible, its lid tied down with green tape, a canvas bag, heavy, folded over at the top and pinned with a horn pin, a smaller wooden box with a brass hasp, and, laid across all of these, a folded sheet of paper sealed with a wafer of red wax. She sat down on the floor of the library with the lamp beside her, and she opened the paper first. The wax cracked cleanly. The hand was old-fashioned and careful, the ink a little browned. She read it once through in silence, and then she read it aloud in the empty room, her voice steady, because Mrs. Bettridge had taught her that a thing read aloud is a thing understood. To whoever finds this and comes upon it in kindness, my name is Margaret Ann Fothergill. I was housekeeper in this manor for 41 years, from the age of 19 until the death of my mistress, and I lived on here alone for 7 years after her, by her express wish and provision. I had no family living. What I have set by in this cupboard is the savings of my whole working life, together with certain items entrusted to me by my mistress at her death, and I leave them here because I would rather they went to a stranger who had need of them than to the lawyers and cousins who never once came up the lane while she lived. The letter went on in the same steady hand, and Martha read the rest of it slowly. Margaret Ann Fothergill wrote that, in the japanned tin, were her savings in gold, and in Bank of England notes, 30 years of a housekeeper's wage laid down coin by coin, and that in the canvas bag were plate and small silver from the mistress's private cabinet, and in the wooden box with the brass hasp were the mistress's own jewels, together with the deed to a strip of pasture behind the walled garden that had never been entered into the estate rolls, and belonged, therefore, to the house free and clear. She wrote that she hoped whoever opened the cupboard would use what she had left to keep the roof over the rooms she had loved. She signed her name in full and gave the date, which was 1811. Martha untied the green tape from the japanned tin and counted the money on the library floor by lamplight. There were 142 sovereigns in 3 cloth rolls, and there were Bank of England notes to the value of £380, and there were 4 half-crowns loose in the bottom of the tin, as though Margaret Ann Fothergill had emptied her purse into it on the last day. Martha counted the money twice, wrote the sum on the fly-leaf of the receipt book in pencil, tied the tape back, and set the tin at her feet. She did not open the canvas bag or the wooden box that night. She banked the fire in the range, bolted the door, and slept. In the morning, Martha walked down into Willow Ridge with 3 sovereigns in her pocket and a list in her head. She spoke first to Mr. Redfern, the village mason, a man of 50, with hands like split flags, and engaged him to relay the west end of the roof and to rebuild the leaning chimney stack. She spoke to Mrs. Ainley, who kept the small shop by the bridge and knew every family in the parish, and she ordered lime, sand, tallow, blacklead, soap, tea, flour, and a bushel of coal to be sent up on the cart. She spoke to a glazier, Mr. Hopwood, who came out from Kirkby the following Tuesday and reglazed the 11 cracked panes in the front bays with new crown glass at 9p a pane. She paid each man in coin on the day the work was done and wrote each sum into the receipt book beneath the fly-leaf tally. The work went in an order Mrs. Bettridge would have approved. Roof first, then chimneys, then windows, then plaster, then floors, then paint. Mr. Redfern brought a boy of 14 called Ned to carry slates up the ladders and to mix mortar in a wooden hod. Ned whistled while he worked and drank his tea with 3 lumps of sugar when Martha gave it to him. A carpenter from the next village, Mr. Allerton, came for 2 weeks and cut new balusters for the staircase from seasoned oak, matching the old turnings exactly, and rehung the kitchen door that had dropped on its hinges. A woman named Peggy Shaw, 42, widowed, walked up from the lane each morning at 6 and scrubbed floors with Martha on her knees beside her, and Peggy would take no more than 8p a day and a plate of bread and dripping at noon. By the end of the 6th week, the roof was tight, the chimneys drew clean, the windows sat true in their frames, and the smell of dry rot had gone out of the hall. Martha filed the deed to the pasture strip at the county office in the market town, paid the fee of 7 shillings and 6p, and had the strip entered into the rolls under her own name. She let it that same month to a farmer named John Beckwith, for grazing at £2 the year, and John Beckwith paid the first half on the day the paper was signed. She opened an account at the country bank on the strength of Margaret Ann Fothergill's notes, and the clerk who counted them looked at her twice and then treated her, from that day, as a woman with business. By midsummer, the manor had ceased to be a ruin and had begun to be a house. Martha had the walled garden cleared by 2 men from the village at 3p the rod. and the old espaliered pears on the south wall. Cut back hard, put out new wood by August. She had the still room off the dairy, scrubbed and whitewashed, and she set out on its shelves the jars and bottles she had begun to fill, from the hedgerows and from the herb beds she uncovered under the nettles. Elderflower, sage, lavender, marshmallow, chamomile, tansy. She wrote the receipts from Mrs. Bettridge's brass-bound book onto fresh labels in her own hand, and tied each label with string. Word of the still room went about the parish as such things do. Mrs. Ainley at the shop by the bridge sent a woman up the lane one September morning whose child had a cough that would not shift, and Martha gave her a bottle of coltsfoot syrup and refused payment. The woman came back a week later with 3 brown eggs in a basket, and the child on her hip, and no cough. After that, the lane up to the manor was walked most days by someone: a girl with a burn, a shepherd with a cracked hand, an old man who could not sleep, a mother whose milk had gone. Martha kept a book of what she gave and to whom, and she took what people brought her without counting it against the medicine: eggs, a pat of butter, a length of wool, a brace of pigeons, a lifted turf of new mint. The vicar, Mr. Whitaker, 61, thin, kind, called in October and drank tea in the library among the aired books, and he said the parish had been the poorer for the manor's shuttering and was the better for its opening. He asked whether Martha would let the parish school use the long parlor on wet Wednesdays, as there was no proper schoolroom, and Martha said she would. From that Wednesday, 12 children came up the lane in their boots and sat on benches. Mr. Allerton had knocked together from offcuts, and a young woman called Anna Bright, 19, the schoolmistress, taught them reading from a slate propped on the parlor table. Martha gave them bread and warm milk at noon and kept the fire built up. She was known in Willow Ridge by her name, by Michaelmas. The men who tipped their hats to her at the crossroads called her Mrs. Whitcomb, and the women who passed her at the shop called her Martha, and both were said with the same weight. On Sunday mornings she walked down to the squat gray church behind the yews and sat in what had been the manor pew, dusted now and cushioned with a piece of the quilted linen coverlet cut down to size, and she stood and knelt with the parish and went home along the lane afterwards, with someone always walking part of the way beside her. On a still afternoon in late November, when the last of the leaves had come down from the limes and the sky over Willow Ridge had settled into that low pearl gray that meant snow within the week, Martha sat alone in the library, at the long table she had wiped clean of green ink and lamp black 6 months before. The fire drew clean up the rebuilt chimney. The reglazed panes held the light without shivering. The oak shelves, oiled with beeswax and turpentine and rubbed to a warm dark color, carried their books upright again in their proper order. And the estate map, cleaned and pressed and reframed by Mr. Allerton in a strip of plain oak, hung once more upon the inner wall. Behind that wall the cupboard stood open and empty, its panel set back into place, but no longer secret, its pegs kept in a small dish on the mantel as a record of what had been done. Martha had before her, laid out on a square of clean linen, 4 things. She had the brass-bound receipt book of Mrs. Bettridge, opened at the flyleaf where the pencil tally of 142 sovereigns and 380 pounds had been written, and beneath it now in ink, a running column of what had been spent and what remained. She had the silver thimble on its green ribbon, untied for once from her neck, and set beside the book, because the room was warm enough that she felt no need of it against her skin. She had the tortoiseshell case, with the miniature of Henry inside, open on its little hinge, his face no larger than a florin, looking sideways at something she could not see. And she had the folded letter of Margaret Ann Fothergill, housekeeper of 41 years, dated 1811, and signed in full, smoothed flat, and weighted at its corners by 4 small river stones. She sat a long time with these 4 things before her. The thimble had come from a woman who had watched Martha lay a fire on 3 lumps of coal, and had known before Martha's own mother had known that Martha was clever. The letter had come from a woman 30 years dead, who had never met her, and had preferred a stranger to the cousins who never once came up the lane. The miniature had come from a boy who had asked with his last clear breath that she not be turned out. The receipt book carried in its margins the hand of the one and the pencil hand of the other, and the 2 hands, Martha thought, would have understood each other without needing to be introduced. She thought of the small parlor with the shutters half closed, and of Augusta laughing, and of Beatrice smiling behind her handkerchief, and of Henry's mother saying that it was like her husband to keep his promises with the least valuable thing in his possession. She did not think of them with heat. She thought of them the way one thinks of weather that has already passed over a house whose roof has since been mended. They had held her cheaply and had let her go for the cost of a mail coach fare, and they had not once written to ask what had become of her. They would not write. She understood now that they had never quite looked at the codicil either, or at the aunt in Willow Ridge, or at any of it, because to look would have been to wonder, and to wonder would have been to lose their laughter, which was the only inheritance they had ever meant to keep. Martha closed the tortoiseshell case, tied the thimble back on its ribbon, folded Margaret Ann Fothergill's letter into the receipt book, and set the 4 things together in the shallow drawer of the long table. Then she banked the fire and went to the kitchen, where Peggy Shaw was setting bread to prove for the morning, and the range breathed evenly through its new-cleaned flue, and she stood in the doorway a moment, watching the ordinary miracle of a warm room in a house that had been shuttered 30 years. Martha Hayes was 24 and newly widowed. She had 11 shillings tied into a handkerchief and a solicitor's key wrapped in brown paper, and she spent nothing to acquire the rotting stone manor at the edge of Willow Ridge that her husband's family had laughed at her for taking. It was the best inheritance she ever accepted. If you have stayed with Martha this far, down the muddy track behind a boy and a donkey, up the sagging stair, into the library, where the panel came loose under a small pry-bar, then take a moment now, before you go, to tap the small heart beneath this story, so the channel knows you were here, and, if it moved you, to share it with someone who has been told, quietly or loudly, that what they were given was not worth the keeping. Subscribe if you have not yet, so that the next tale of a shuttered house and a patient woman finds its way to you when the evenings draw in. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and whether it is raining there, or clear, or the kind of low pearl sky that means snow within the week, because we like to picture the rooms these stories travel into. And before you go on with your evening, sit with this a moment. Almost every one of us has been handed, at some point, a thing that other people were quick to call worthless. A house nobody wanted to visit. A trade nobody thought would feed us. A friendship the rest of the family did not understand. A grief we were told to put down and get on with. A quiet skill learned at the elbow of someone older, who did not live to see us use it. The people who laugh at such inheritances almost always laugh because they have not looked closely, and because looking closely would ask something of them they do not wish to give. Martha's story is not, in the end, about gold behind a library wall. It is about the habit of looking, patiently and without shame, at what has been left in your hands, and about trusting that the woman who taught you to lay a fire on 3 lumps of coal, or the man who asked with his last breath that you not be turned out, or the stranger who tied a green tape around a tin 30 years before you were born, all of them together are on your side of the ledger. So the question we leave with you tonight is this: what has been handed to you that others were quick to call worthless, and what might you find if you took a lamp and a small pry bar and looked behind its plainest wall? Tell us in the comments. We read them, in the evenings, by our own fires. Walk gently, keep your accounts in ink, and we will see you again along the next muddy lane.